You are standing in a dusty genetics lab on a Tuesday afternoon, coffee cold in your hand, staring at a computer screen full of model output you have run maybe 40 times. The numbers keep landing in the same place, and the numbers are telling you something impossible. This is roughly what a group of population geneticists must have felt like in 2023, when a method they had just built, a tool called FitCoal that reads the deep past out of modern genomes, kept returning the same baffling figure. At some point around 930,000 years ago, the ancestors of every person alive on Earth today had thinned out so drastically that only a tiny group remained. We are not talking about a village. We are talking about a number so small that, by the cruel arithmetic of survival, the entire human lineage almost went out, almost ended, almost never reached you. Here is the number that keeps people up at night. Around 930,000 years ago, the total number of breeding individuals in the human ancestral line dropped to about 1,280. That is not 12,000. It is not even 5,000. Can anyone wrap their head around that? It is roughly the size of a large high school, a number of people you could fit into a football stadium and have empty seats left over, and those few thousand people spread somehow across an ancient landscape, some of them hunting, some of them gathering, none of them knowing they were engaged in the most consequential holding action in all of human history, carried within their small, fragile bodies the entire genetic future of our species. Every face you have ever known, every person you have ever loved, every language, every city, every invention, all of it was in that one small room of a population, holding on. By the time this video ends, you will never hear the phrase survival of the fittest the same way again, because it turns out that luck, plain, dumb, unearned luck, may have had more to do with you sitting here today than any amount of intelligence or strength, and I am going to show you how we know what that tiny number actually means, how close we really came, and why, in a strange and humbling way, your entire existence might come down to a few hundred people who happen to make it through a disaster nobody alive today can fully name. Now, before we get into the details, let me be honest about what this claim is and is not. This is not a story we made up to be dramatic. It comes from a real piece of science, published in 2023, and it rests on a genuinely clever idea. The idea is that the DNA you carry around today contains, buried inside it, a record of the past, like rings in a tree, and that by reading billions of genomes together with a powerful new statistical method, researchers can reach back further than anyone thought possible and reconstruct ancient population sizes. The method, named FitCoal, was built by a team of geneticists, including Wang Jia and others. And when they pointed it at modern human genomes, it told them something no one expected. Somewhere around 930,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern humans went through a bottleneck so severe that their numbers crashed to more than 99% of their previous levels and stayed low for a terrifying stretch of time. Let me make sure you feel the shape of that, because it matters. A population bottleneck is not just a dip in numbers. It is a window in which almost everything is lost. When a population crashes, genetic diversity collapses with it. Rare gene variants vanish. The variety that lets a species adapt to new dangers shrinks down to almost nothing. And when that happens, the group does not just get smaller. It gets more fragile. One bad disease, one bad winter, one bad decade, and the whole thing could have blinked out like a candle. The human lineage apparently spent over 100,000 years in exactly that kind of fragile state. And the fact that we are here to talk about it is, statistically speaking, something close to a miracle. So what actually happened around 930,000 years ago? This is the part where the science has to be honest about what it does not know. The FitCoal results tell us that the population crashed, but they do not, by themselves, tell us exactly why. And yet the timing is so striking that researchers have been circling a small cluster of suspects, and the leading suspect is climate. The period around 930,000 years ago sits inside something geologists call the mid-Pleistocene transition. A phase when the Earth's climate shifted into longer, deeper, more violent glacial cycles. Ice sheets expanded, sea levels fell, whole regions of vegetation turned to tundra, and the resources that wandering human groups depended on became scarcer, more unpredictable, and more brutally patchy across the map. And here is a detail that makes the whole story even more precarious, because it suggests the crisis may have come in waves, not as a single neat disaster. Around this time, the archaeological record in many parts of the world shows what looks like a thinning out of human presence. Fewer sites, longer gaps, whole regions apparently abandoned for stretches. In Africa, the cradle where the human story began, there are signs that the population was not just shrinking but becoming more isolated, groups cut off from each other as the climate slammed doors shut. Some researchers suspect this was the period that carved the earliest physical differences among human populations, tiny isolated groups adapting to their own corners of a harsher world, in the long cold shadow of a nearly extinct species. Now, here is where the puzzle gets genuinely strange. Who would have guessed a near extinction could shape our future? You would think that almost going extinct would be pure catastrophe for our genetic inheritance, that surviving with so few people would leave us permanently weakened, inbred, fragile, and in a sense, it did. That bottleneck stripped away enormous amounts of genetic diversity that we have never fully gotten back, which is part of why humans today are, genetically speaking, a fairly uniform species, less diverse than many other great apes. But that same near catastrophe may have done something unexpected. Some researchers have argued that the bottleneck, by shrinking the population so dramatically, may have helped a key set of genetic changes sweep through and become fixed. In other words, the great and terrible winnowing may have acted like a forge, hammering out the genetic foundations for what would eventually become modern humans. Let me give you a concrete shape for how shocking this number really is, because it is easy to say 1,280 and not feel it. Imagine you were in charge of a city that had to carry the entire future of the human species. Now imagine that city suddenly had about 1,200 people in it, spread out, vulnerable, with no guarantee any of them would survive the next generation. That is the situation our ancestors faced. Think about all the ways that could have gone wrong. One epidemic, one supernova throwing radiation at Earth, and there is actually a candidate for a nearby supernova around that time. One prolonged drought, one harsh winter after another. Any of those, and the story of humanity would have ended before it really began. And you, reading this, would simply never have existed. No memory, no descendants, no future. Just a branch that withered in the wind 930,000 years ago. There is a strange and quietly haunting thought tucked inside all of this, and I want to sit with it for a moment. Every person alive today is descended from that small group. That means you, sitting there, are connected through an unbroken chain of mothers and fathers to people who survived a disaster with the odds stacked brutally against them. There is no intimacy like it. The hand that held yours as a child, the hands that held theirs, stretching back and back and back, all the way to a small circle of survivors who had no idea they were carrying the future of the world. When you feel alone, when you wonder if you matter, there is an argument buried in 900,000 years of history that you are, quite literally, the product of survivors, the point of a spear that almost broke and did not. But here is where I want to be careful, because this story is also a story about evidence, and evidence deserves your respect. The FitCoal result is genuinely exciting, and it has generated real discussion. But it is a model built from genetics, and models are only as good as the assumptions they rest on. Not every researcher agrees that the bottleneck was quite that severe, or that the timing is quite that precise. And some have pointed out that reconstructing events 900,000 years old from modern genomes is a deeply uncertain business. That honesty matters, because the story is more compelling, not less. When we admit that science is a live conversation, a detective process with open questions rather than a finished verdict handed down from on high. And yet, even with that healthy skepticism, there is something the bottleneck story cannot be dismissed for, and it is the far older reality that underlies all of it. Whatever the exact number, whatever the exact date, the core fact is not really in dispute. The human lineage came very close to extinction, more than once, and it survived less because of any single heroic choice than because of luck and persistence and the sheer stubbornness of life. We carry the marks of those narrow escapes in our genomes today, reduced diversity, the echoes of ancient crashes, and they are a quiet reminder that existence is not guaranteed, that the whole magnificent edifice of human culture is built on a foundation of close calls. Here is what I want you to take away, the part that is not about ancient chromosomes but about you. When you look at the people around you, when you feel the weight of your own small, ordinary days, remember what it took to get here. Remember the tiny group, maybe 1,200 strong, who kept the flame alive through 100,000 years of cold and scarcity and uncertainty. Your problems, however heavy, are the problems of a species that already refused, against all odds, to stop. The ancestors who nearly went extinct did not know they were saving a future. They were just trying to survive the week, the season, the year, and that was enough. It was always enough. There is one more turn in this story that I find almost unbearably moving, and it is the one that brings it all the way home to you. That long walk out of near extinction eventually led to everything, to farmers, to cities, to writing, to ships, to rockets, to the screen you are reading this on right now. And all of it, every last brick of it, rests on a foundation of people who had no idea they were the foundation. When they huddled through that ancient crisis, they did not know that one day their descendants would ask questions like this, would have the audacity to reach back across 1,000,000 years and try to count them. And yet here we are, doing exactly that. The descendants of the 1,280 alive, curious, asking about the people who almost did not make it. So when you hear the word human, when you think about what it means, add this layer to it. To be human is to come from a place where things almost ended. To be human is to be the improbable, lucky, stubborn continuation of a story that could have closed 930,000 years ago. The bottleneck is not a footnote in our past. It is the secret shape of our origin, the narrow door we barely squeeze through. And every time you feel like the odds are against you, you can remind yourself that you are built from people who beat odds far worse than anything you will ever face. Before you trust a single number in this story, it is worth digging into where the number actually comes from, because that is the part that separates real science from a good ghost story. The human genome is not just the instructions for building a body. It is also a living archive, a library of millions of small genetic differences that have been accumulating, drifting, expanding, and shrinking for hundreds of thousands of years. Most of those differences are invisible to us, harmless spelling variations that neither help nor hurt, but they leave traces. And crucially, those traces are shaped by population size. When a population is large, its common variants spread broadly and evenly. When a population crashes, whole lineages of variants vanish, and the ones that survive become more concentrated, more alike, like the family resemblance in a small, isolated town. So by reading the distribution of variants in thousands of modern genomes and working backward through a tangled family tree, a method like FitCoal can reconstruct, with a bundle of uncertainty, how big the ancient population was and how it moved up and down over time. The team behind the 2023 finding is worth naming, because this was not the work of a lone crackpot in a basement, but a collaboration of population geneticists who spent years building and testing their own tool before they trusted it. The study, published in the journal Science, was led by researchers including Wang Jie from the Institute of Zoology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, working with colleagues at East China Normal University and other institutions. What made their work stand out was not just the dramatically small number they found, But the length of the crisis it revealed. The crash, around 930,000 years ago, did not rebound quickly the way a short famine might. Instead, the population apparently remained tiny, in that fragile zone of a few thousand breeding individuals, for roughly 117,000 years, a staggeringly long stretch during which extinction was, generation, an ever-present possibility. Let me put that timescale into something you can actually hold. 117,000 years is long enough for an entire way of life to be invented and forgotten many times over. It is long enough for languages to be born, evolve, and die, for climates to swing from cold to warm and back again, for entire species of animals to appear and vanish. And through all of that, our ancestors were clinging to existence with a population barely large enough to fill a single, large village. Imagine the psychological weight of that, if they had any awareness of it at all. No written record, no shared memory, just the immediate pressing business of feeding themselves and keeping their children alive, one day folding into the next, with no way to know that their tiny flame was the last one left. This is also where the story connects to a broader question that has fascinated paleoanthropologists for decades. And it is a question you might not expect. Around the time of the bottleneck, the fossil record shows that humanity was not a single tidy family line, but a messy, branching bush of related human forms, walking upright in different places, with different faces and different brains. There were robust forms with heavy brow ridges and thick skulls, and there were more lightly built forms, and one of the great mysteries of the period is how these threads wove together, interbred, competed, and sometimes died out. The bottleneck story adds a new wrinkle to that old puzzle. If the population crashed so dramatically, it might have collapsed the diversity among those different human forms, funneling them through a single narrow genetic channel before they expanded outward again, which would help explain why later human populations from Neanderthals in Europe to early modern humans in Africa share a common thread that runs back to this very narrow point. Now, you might reasonably ask, is there any archaeological proof on the ground for this genetic story? Or is it all just math on a screen? And the honest answer is that the genetic and the archaeological records do not always line up neatly. But there are hints. In many parts of the Old World, the fossil and stone tool record around 930,000 years ago is remarkably sparse, characterized by long gaps and few sites, as if the human presence on the landscape thinned dramatically for a while before picking back up. That sparseness has long puzzled archaeologists, and the bottleneck offers a possible explanation for it. A period when, quite simply, there were very few humans around to leave bones and tools behind. The two independent lines of evidence, the DNA and the rocks, pointing in the same general direction, is what makes the story feel less like speculation and more like a genuine discovery in progress. And here is where my favorite detail comes in, because it ties the whole thing to the sky above our heads, and it is the kind of coincidence that makes you feel small in a good way. Around the time of the proposed bottleneck, there is evidence that Earth may have been exposed to a nearby supernova, a star that exploded close enough to bathe the planet in a blast of radiation. Researchers have suggested that such an event could have boosted the rate of lethal mutations, or punched holes in the ozone layer, or both, adding yet another layer of pressure to a species already teetering. Now, the link between that ancient supernova and the human population crash is speculative, a fascinating hypothesis rather than a firm fact. But it is a perfect illustration of how small and exposed our ancestors truly were, caught between a changing climate and a violent cosmos, with nothing but biology and stubbornness to see them through. And this is where I want to pause, because there is a question hiding in all of this that is not really about genes or fossils at all. What does it mean that you and I are the descendants of a group that almost vanished, that nearly every possible version of humanity was, at some ancient moment, one bad season away from never happening? It reframes the whole idea of inevitability. We like to imagine that humanity, rise was destiny, that the march from cave to city was written in the stars. The bottleneck whispers something colder and more honest. It says that history has no guarantees, that the future can pivot on a whim of weather, on the luck of one harsh winter, and that everything we take for granted, the chairs we sit on, the languages we think in, the very minds doing the thinking, could so easily have been nothing at all. There is comfort buried in that thought, though it takes a moment to find it. If our survival came down to luck and persistence rather than to any special brilliance, then the lesson is not that we are doomed, but that survival is earned one ordinary day at a time. The ancestors did not triumph because they were geniuses. They triumphed because they kept going, because some small group in some forgotten valley refused to stop, and that refusal compounded into everything. Forget the grand stories for a moment. Do you want to know what the real miracle was? A bunch of tired, hungry people who woke up again and again and decided to try one more time. The population almost vanished. You are the reason it did not.